Thanks Chris Kern and Sarah Gregory and ODFW staff for the tour yesterday, which unfortunately I didn't make. But I've heard that it was very good. And for Helena Linnell of the Coquel tribe for participating and helping out. And any of the public that were on the tour as well. Thank you. Chair Wall is unable to attend today. I'm Jill Zarnowitz, Vice Chair of the Fish and Wildlife Commission, and now call the Friday, October 14th, 2022 Commission meeting to order. I live between the towns of Yamhill and Carlton in the Willamette Valley. Before I complete the introductions, I and the Commission would like to congratulate Director Kurt Melcher on being elected as President of the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, or AFWA. I understand he is only the second ODFW director to be elected president of AFWA in its 112-year history. And the other director was Phil Schneider, who we do have a wildlife area named after. So congratulations, Kurt.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair Zarnowitz. I truly appreciate that. And as I told the executive staff when they congratulated me shortly after the election, that they can congratulate me now and they'll probably all hate me in a year after I have served this tenure. But it is a great honor, incredibly humbled to take on the assignment. And I did look up because I was curious to see if any other Oregonians had served, and I felt even more honored to know that Phil Schneider was the only previous Oregon director to serve in this capacity. So, yeah. So it's a great honor, and I really appreciate your understanding in the coming months as I travel around the country, including a week from tomorrow to Charleston, West Virginia. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Well, we always can contact you by phone.
Yes, you can.
So we'll do the introductions. Fish and Wildlife Commissioner Kurt has the honor of being president of AFWA. Big deal. And Commissioner Spelbrink.
Hey, good morning. Bob Spelbrink, Slice, Oregon, District 5.
Commissioner Khalil.
Hi, Kathy and Khalil, Western Oregon at large, and I live in Portland.
And Commissioner King.
Good morning. Leslie King. I represent the 3rd Congressional District, which includes the city of Portland and surrounding areas.
And Director Melcher.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair Zarnowitz. And I'm Kurt Melcher. I'm the Director of the Department of Fish and Wildlife, and happy to be here in Coos Bay, Oregon. And thanks to the staff, I think as you already mentioned yesterday, for providing us with a great tour. Thanks to the Coquel tribe for their hospitality as well, and looking forward to today's meeting.
Yeah. And then Michelle Tate.
Good morning. I'm Michelle Tate with the Director's Office. I'm here to provide support to the Director and the Commission to hold this meeting at a hybrid model. Thank you.
Okay. And Michelle, are there any tribal officers or commissioners?
So.
No, okay. So then we'll go to the Director's report.
All right. Thanks, Chair Zarnowitz. Commissioners, we did provide you with written field reports, and we'd be happy to answer any questions you might have on those. We do have Shannon Hearn. If the technology is working, Deputy Director Hearn will provide the expenditure report from her office in Salem. And if that is not working, I will do that in her stead.
Thank you, Director Melcher. Well, let's test it out. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Great. Chair Zarnowitz, members of the committee, for the record, Shannon Hearn, Deputy Director for Administration. Thank you for the time today. We've submitted a financial report in your packet. Briefly, for the month ending August 31st, 2022, the unrestricted cash balance finished at $68.6 million, while the restricted cash came in at $46.3 million, giving us a total of $114.9 million in ending balance. The unrestricted cash did see a dip of $2.6 million from July. However, we saw a bump up in restricted cash, approximately $5.5 million, mainly due to Fish Streams of Passage program receiving an increase of $5 million in their fund from the American Rescue Plan Act. And we remain on track for expenditures this biennium. We're about 58% through the biennium now. On the 23-25 budget, agency request budget, still no word from the Chief Financial Office about when the agency will meet with them, but we anticipate it will be in October, and we'll be hearing from them very soon. We'll get a look at that analyst recommended budget and have a chance to meet with them and talk in depth about our budget. And then last, pretty simply, no new audit updates. Our internal auditor is making progress on those fiscal year 23 risk assessment topics chosen. And then the committee will meet again in November 30th, on November 30th. So thank you for your time. Please let me know if you have any questions.
Are there any questions? None.
Very good. Thanks, Shannon. Appreciate the update. We'll go next to our standing director's report item on adapting to climate and ocean change. And I believe Sarah is in the room here. And I'm not sure if Mike Moore is in the room or is he? He's joining virtually. So sparing Mike the travel from Klamath Falls.
That's right. Using technology to our advantage.
Yes.
Well, we'll get our steps in with this big conference room today, where staff are sitting in the back to the front here. Good morning, Vice Chair Zarnowitz, members of the commission. I am Sarah Reif. I am the Habitat. He serves the Klamath watershed district. He's based out of Klamath Falls. He and I will be tag team this presentation today, and appreciate him joining us because it's always good to have that perspective from the folks that are out on the ground. So one of our key conservation issues under the umbrella of climate and ocean change is renewable energy development in sort of under two framings. One, how do we encourage renewable energy development as it's a key strategy for addressing climate change? But two, how do we plan for that footprint and that impact and the potential that it has to impact fish and wildlife habitat? And so this is just an informational presentation for you all, sort of contemplating the complexity of that situation that we're working our way through. And so we'll be I'll cover the policy drivers of renewable energy, sort of what are we seeing and what's, is coming. Also, Mike will take us through a case study of solar development patterns and mule deer interactions in the Klamath watershed. And then I'll wrap up with just some updates for you on some of the big priority for us as a state. Governor Brown's executive order 2004 set targets of a 45% reduction in carbon emissions from 1990 levels by 2035 and an 80% reduction in emissions by 2050. So an ambitious target. She directed state agencies to take action. So part of what we're doing here is in response to that direction. And as alongside all of our other, sister agencies as well. We also have a renewable portfolio standard in Oregon. This has been around for a while. The original standard was adopted in 2007 when just 2% of Oregon's electricity needs were being met with renewables. This standard sets a requirement for how much of the electricity we use must come from renewable sources. And so in this case, renewable means the source of power can be used repeatedly because it is replaced naturally. So things like wind and sun. In March 2016, the RPS was updated to increase the standard requirement to 50% renewables by 2040. And so this was our ambitious target up until the passage of the House Bill 2021, which set clean energy standards. This required Oregon's largest providers, our largest energy providers, to reach 100% clean electricity sold to Oregonians by 2040. This is the most aggressive timeline in the country for moving to 100% clean electricity sources by 2040, slightly just edging out Washington that also has a fairly ambitious clean energy standard. It also prohibits the siting of new natural gas, coal, and other fossil fuel-based electric generating facilities. It allocates funds to developing community-based renewable energy projects so that there's resiliency across the state in the event of large-scale outages. and also increases the focus on environmental justice and calls for significant increases in local community stakeholder engagement in energy planning. So this is the next couple of slides are courtesy of our colleagues at the Oregon Department of Energy. Adam Schultz is the energy and policy and markets lead for Department of Energy. And this is one of his slides that he uses in his presentations. Basically, this shows an analysis done from consultants who looked at economy-wide decarbonization in the Pacific Northwest. So this is a regional look, calling for, if you look at, I don't know how well you can all see that with the lighting in here, but it starts at 2020, showing very little, or that's sort of our baseline current condition of new resources, new renewable energy development that we would need in order to meet those targets. And the upshot basically is that we'd be looking to add about 80 gigawatts of new solar and wind capacity in the Pacific Northwest. I think the Department of Energy is still working on the statistics that'll come out in November in their biennial energy report in terms of what our current level is, but I think it's somewhere around 10 or 11 gigawatts in the Pacific Northwest. So we're talking about a very substantial increase, and that in order to get there, we would need to be adding almost 3 gigawatts per year. Another model, just to focus more narrowly into Oregon, each of these models is showing, these are just different scenarios that the same consultants used to model total capacity development that would be necessary through 2050. And I won't get into the specifics of the scenarios modeled here, but want to point out the scale that across the 6 scenarios modeled, the directionality is the same. Approximately 30 gigawatts of new renewable energy would need to be developed in Oregon to meet those clean energy targets. And you probably can't see what those colors represent too terribly well, but I'll tell you that hydro is along the bottom, somewhat static. Gas is at the very bottom, somewhat static. The lighter blue is land-based wind, so you don't see that significantly increasing, but the green is offshore wind. And so you're seeing a substantial increased need in offshore wind in order to meet that gigawatt target. And then the yellow on top is solar. So under any scenario that these consultants looked at, the vast majority of the new development is going to be coming either through photovoltaic solar or from offshore wind. So that's the push, right? Like that's the need at the national and regional and state level. And that it's important. We know that, we need to go there, but we also know that renewable energy comes with its own development footprint and that it's not without impacts to fish and wildlife habitat. Primary impact of concern is habitat loss or fragmentation of lands and waters, crucial for migration, overwintering, and breeding. This is of particular concern for some of the more land-intensive forms of renewable energy development. For example, solar averages needing about 7 to 10 acres per megawatt. And we're seeing projects proposed, at 500 megawatts in scale and larger. And so it's a fairly land-intensive form of development. Not uncommon for us to see proposals coming in around 7,000, 9,000 acres in size. Depending on the type of energy development, there are a number of potential impacts that we're trying to better understand and that we're trying to address. Direct impacts like collision mortalities with wind turbine blades or transmission lines. Indirect impacts, things like displacement just caused by the human presence in these new, what were otherwise fairly undisturbed landscapes, lighting, noise, or changes in ecological function. And then cumulative effects, which Mike will talk a little bit more about in a minute. But as renewable energy proliferates, the single project impacts begin to accumulate into a landscape scale or population level impact, but it's very difficult to track and even more difficult to regulate. I will say, you can't quite see it on the screen that you're looking at, but I do have some links at the bottom of this slide that will be available when this presentation is posted online for you all and for the members of the public to really dive into. There's a lot of really great resources out there, great organizations that are compiling the information about what the best available science about what the interactions are of wildlife and renewable energy. So I would encourage folks to check that out. I will also say, I should have said at the beginning, offshore wind, we'll likely be coming back to you all with a more in-depth look at offshore wind because there's so much to talk about and we really couldn't combine it with the solar conversation with the time that we have. But that is a very active and ongoing planning process right now for offshore wind off the coast of Oregon. And so we'll bring Karen Braby and the Marine Program in to share updates there with you, potentially in January, I think. So our role in energy permitting is we are not the regulator. We are in a technical assistance role. We make recommendations consistent with our mitigation policy, with the climate and ocean change policy. One footnote is that, when it comes to projects that are going to have an impact to fish passage, then we do sort of step into that regulatory space. But in general, we are making recommendations to state and local and federal agencies who are doing the regulation of these facilities. So we're an information and science provider. We're a consultant on how to meet the standards, the wildlife standards in everybody's various regulatory processes. We always approach it using that mitigation policy framework of avoid, minimize, mitigate. And we are in the business of being really practical and seeking balanced solutions. So we have the challenge that we face as stewards of Oregon's fish and wildlife resources is that while we support renewable energy development that meets these criteria, this issue of what it means to be well-sited is a pretty complicated one. We acknowledge we need to see a lot more renewable energy development. It's an integral part of our clean energy future. But we do have these co-equal goals of addressing climate change and preventing habitat loss. So we do support, and this is sort of our position on renewable energy here, we do support renewable energy development that is thoughtfully sited, responsibly operated, and adequately mitigated. But what does it mean to be well sited? What may seem like an ideal location for solar development because it's there's good sunshine, close to transmission, it's relatively flat, you have willing landowners. There are a lot of constraints on renewable energy developers. It's not easy to find these sites that are large enough for them to build these projects. But that same piece of ground may also be an ideal location for wintering mule deer or breeding sage grouse or waterfowl migration. And so in the next set of slides, Mike Moore is going to walk us through a case study that we feel demonstrates this complexity of siting for you and how we're beginning to acknowledge and address cumulative effects. Mike, if you're with us, you can take it from here.
Yeah, hopefully y'all can hear me.
We can, thanks.
Perfect, excellent. Chair Zarnowitz, Commissioners, Director Melcher, I'm Mike Moore, Regional Habitat Biologist for the Klamath watershed in South Central Oregon here. Appreciate the opportunity to chat with you briefly this morning to talk about renewable energy and how it's being seen and impacting the fish and wildlife and their habitats down south here. If you want to move on to the next slide, Sarah. Thank you. So jump right into it. This first slide, wanted to point out a couple main things. This is the Klamath watershed we're looking at here. And the two main things to point out, that the dotted lines are transmission lines. And those are high kilovolt transmission lines that are kind of spiderweb throughout the watershed. And then the purple, and it might come up as pink on yours, but the polygons are the potential renewable energy build out. And to define that, it's the potential build out means they're at different stages. Each one of those polygons actually has a number of different projects in with them. As you can see, that one to the north is 14 projects. They're all solar for a total of about 87,000 acres for the footprint. And some of these are actually functioning and producing electricity on the grid. Some of them are permitted and some of them are in the process right now. And they may or may not have been publicly vetted. So in order for that to to meet the intent of this, we lumped them all together and just call it proposed build out. It should still be able to really get a sight picture on what we're looking at. And one of the things I did want to highlight with this particular slide is the potential build out of renewable energy. And this is solar, wind, and pump storage, but primarily solar down here. They're located associated with the transmission lines almost exclusively, as you'll see, and that's a deliberate strategic move, I guess, where it minimizes the amount of infrastructure that is needed to produce electricity and get it onto the grid. And on the right, we have a bar chart and a pie chart, which kind of sums up what we're seeing out here. As you can see, the majority are solar projects. There's 29 solar projects, 2 wind and 1 pump storage. And the bar chart shows the amount of acres that potentially could be affected. 106,000 solar acres, 143,000 wind, and just a little bit of a pump storage. Next slide, please. Thank you. And this slide, I added a couple layers. The blue, what you're looking at, the light blue, is big game winter range. And then the lines going throughout, those are mule deer migration patterns. They're straight lines. As you know, mule deer don't walk in straight lines, but it takes the average of their summer range and the average of their winter range and draws or puts a point, a centroid is called, and draws a line between them. But as you can see, this particular slide, I think, is really good at painting a good picture on what mule deer need for their life history. And it is quite obvious they need unfragmented habitats to facilitate their connectivity between their summer and winter range, and the relationship between these transmission lines and what we've already seen with build out is becoming quite apparent. And as Sarah had briefed earlier, some of the objectives by 2050 with the executive order and the association with these power lines, you can draw some conclusions on how, what the amount of pink and what this might look like. And certainly mule deer will, the fragmentation and the ability for them to move between their summer and their winter range can certainly be compromised. Next slide, please. And this is just another slide of the same area, and except it's looking at it through a different lens. The salmon color are conservation opportunity areas. If you're not familiar with that, the Oregon Conservation Strategy got updated just a few years ago, and it basically identifies priority focal points or focal areas of strategy habitats and the strategy species associated with them as well. And they're not immune to habitat loss and fragmentation and loss of connectivity as well. And this is looked at as we're engaged by the solar proponent as well, beyond what our robust mule deer populations data provides. The challenge that we see in a lot of these is many of these strategy species and OCAMP, the Oregon Connectivity Mapping Project that the connectivity biologist is spearheading, we're lacking a lot of data in a lot of those. They certainly is some effort to push the needle to get more of those data sets, but a lot of it is we're very, very limited, and it's difficult to quantify the impacts and the cumulative impacts that we might be seeing as we see build out on the landscape. Next slide, please. Thank you. And this one narrows the lens a little bit more, and what we're looking at is just North Lake County, and the purple polygon right there in the center, that's around Christmas Valley. And this particular side I felt highlights really good what some of the challenges that the mule deer are going to be facing as build out continues. The summer range is generally off to the left-hand side of your screen there in the Fremont, Wainema, and the Deschutes National Forest, and the winter range is off to the east. The longest of these lines is about 80 miles. That's 80. And if you you follow along, if it's clear enough, and I hope it is, you can see many of these deer have to cross 3 or 4 transmission lines in order to get to their summer range, which they've been shown to have high fidelity too. And the cumulative effects and the fragmentation of this habitat can be a real challenge as we look at some of these projects and the build out on the landscape. And I also would say these lines, as this project was done, 1 deer was collared for every 185 that is on the landscape. And so if you were thinking of absolute numbers, there'd be 185 times as many lines, which is just within this slide would be about 35,000 deer affected. And if I remember right, and I meant to look it up this morning, but I think we're about at 175,000 mule deer across the state. So we're talking about a significantly be impacted through a renewable energy build out. Not to mention some of the other side effects that we may have on that is as they're displaced, they may be challenges with damage, social issues with them moving on to ag lands, as well as transportation challenges. And this slide here is just basically a boiled down site picture of when staff is engaged by solar proponents, how we look at everything's guided by the ODFW Fish and Wildlife Mitigation Plan. And within that, the bullet points here kind of highlight some of the main features of it. For the category 1 is what's called the migration corridors, vernal pools. That's absolutely irreplaceable. Staff would recommend total avoidance. For other habitats, we call category 2 limited and essential on landscape, big game winter range, wetlands. We try to avoid to the greatest extent we can, but where we can't, we ask for compensatory mitigation, and along with the mitigation and following the mitigation plan on there, we also look at best management practices, monitoring, minimization measures, everything that can be done to minimize the impact to both wildlife and the wildlife habitats. Next slide, perfect. And so some of the challenges, just to sum things up here, the cumulative impacts are difficult to quantify. As we're seeing more and more of these materialize on the landscape, and we are engaged with different regulatory agencies, the county, the state, and BLM, and it's nobody's really tracking the cumulative effects. And so being able to keep your thumb on the pulse, it's really challenging as the various different timelines and different agencies to work with to be able to quantify that. Moving on, next bullet point, and we had highlighted that renewable energy is co-located generally along transmission lines, and some of the challenges and that some of those maps hopefully we're able to highlight fairly well as the fragmentation and the overall loss to some of these critical habitats. And as taking that further, what are the potential population level impacts that we may be seeing? Mule deer have been suffering, I guess you could say. They've had a lot of challenges for a number of decades, and the cumulative impacts on them can certainly be realized as we continue to see build out on the landscape. Economic hunting, economic impacts to some of these rural areas that rely on hunting as in the economics of hunting for sustainability will be certainly felt. And we'll kind of touch just a little bit on the displacement and onto neighboring ag lands, dealing with damage and landowners on some of the issues associated with that, as well as the transportation, deer versus car as displacement happens, can be a challenge, and as displacement happens, I would expect we continue to see some issues associated with that as we navigate through those waters. And also the conservation strategies, some of those species that we just have limited data sets on to be able to quantify what are some of the impacts to them. And finally, to kind of wrap it up, the mitigation, as Sarah had kind of highlighted briefly earlier, it's costly and it can be really challenging for a lot of the developers. Finding areas to provide durable offsets can be challenging, and I would imagine will continue to get more and more challenging as more of these are materializing on the landscape. And last but certainly not least, is each one of these is individual and isn't really a cookie cutter type of an approach to all of these. And so there's a significant amount of staff resource that goes into each one of these to ensure the habitats and species are taken into consideration. So I thank you for your time. And I think, Sarah, do you have more at this point, or are we open for?
I do. I've got a few more. And thank you, Mike. Really, the view from the ground is always so helpful in these conversations.
You bet.
So really, I think what it boils down for us is that in order to get in front of this issue, the more we can focus on those proactive planning conversations to strategically site renewable energy, the better we can get ahead of this issue and avoid those cumulative impacts to some of those really critical resources and really critical functions out there on the landscape for wildlife. So what is a well-sited project? If we are putting so much energy into siting, what does that actually mean? In its simplest form, it's where we can avoid those important wildlife habitats. That will involve some compromise because a lot of the landscape is important to a lot of different species. So it does involve us having data. It does involve us prioritizing. But what we're also encouraging is prioritizing siting of renewables on previously disturbed lands, other infrastructure, reclaimed mines, industrial sites, brownfields. Nationally, there's a big interest in how can we incentivize and facilitate renewable energy development on brownfields. And in some cases, co-locating these renewable energy facilities with fallow agricultural lands or lands where it can be compatible with ongoing agricultural practices. As I said, it often requires compromise. There are so many factors that developers are facing in terms of where they can't go. They have to have offsets or setbacks from communities. They have to have willing landowners. They have to take into account threatened and endangered species, cultural resources, neighbor concerns, and that the available lands for them to build these facilities get smaller and smaller when they compound all of those factors. So it's not easy. And I think it's important for us to acknowledge that and be willing to come to the table recognizing those intersectional factors and come to the table ready to compromise. But I think also what's good is that at the statewide level, there are those conversations going on. There are some fairly large roundtables being pulled together with diverse stakeholders, more diverse and larger than I think we've seen in the past. And I think that's very encouraging to have these conversations about can we find those areas of intersection where we can all get behind siting renewables in those places. And then a follow-on conversation to that is how can we incentivize siting in those places? That's best done when we have rich data that we're all working with. And recently, the Oregon Department of Energy completed this renewable energy siting assessment tool. This is a totally voluntary tool. It's a library of spatial data, and there's an online tool where you and any member of the public can go online, take a look at an area of interest, overlay some of these factors, whether they be wildlife factors, community factors. You can look at, military overflight corridors, for example, relative to a wind energy project. There's all sorts of data in this tool. This was just finalized this year. I have a link there as well that'll be in the posted slides. Really encourage folks to check that out. This is, it can help facilitate data-driven discussions and we're encouraged by now everyone having the same information upon which to base these conversations. And lastly, I'll just say that when these conversations are going on statewide as they are right now about siting and how can we as a state plan for the types of energy we want to see and where we want that energy to go. ODFW is always going to be at the table for that, always going to come with a collaborative spirit. We really think this collaboration is the key to finding a path forward despite this complexity. So we're encouraged by the ongoing statewide conversations, committed to finding those solutions, and we'll keep you updated as those conversations continue. I believe that's it from us, unless there are any questions.
Okay. Thank you, Sarah and Mike. Go ahead. Mr. Labhart.
Thank you. Can you go back 2 slides, Sarah? One more. Yeah, right there. So, and you and I've had this discussion already, but the worst possible scenario that we face is if somebody applies for a project, goes to the county says, okay, we'll begin the planning process, and then it all starts with working with the agencies, and oh my Lord, that's critical deer winter range. And so it creates just a huge workload for staff. It creates controversy. And so this upfront siting of working together collaboratively with facilities potentially out there and this groups that you were talking about, I mean, I just can't support that strong enough. Let's talk beforehand and try to find the solutions here that we can work on. And it may not be perfect, but it's going to be a lot better than actually citing it or proposing a citing and then starting through all the back and forth. So I just strongly support that. Getting a well-cited project involves upfront work, developing relationships, cooperating, and I'm just very pleased to see that you're mentioning this process, because I think this is going to be the way to go. Not that it's going to be perfect, but it'll hopefully reduce a lot of stress on both the energy companies, the agencies that got to work with it, the county planning departments that got to go through the permitting process and all of that. So just a strong supporter for this upfront work. So thank you for your work on that.
Commissioner Hatfield-Hyde.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah, so much for the presentation. I mean, I do have to say that it's a little daunting and a little disturbing when you think about what we're facing here. And I think I've said this over and over again since I've been on the commission. The faster we can get sort of some of that OCamp data out there so that the public can see it, really see these migration corridors for example, mule deer, who are dear to my heart, right? I think the better we are at giving people a spatial sense of what we're impacting when we put in these kind of projects. I know that I love that big Oregon desert. And when most people drive through it, they think there is nothing here. And they couldn't be more wrong. There's so much going on out there. So I understand that we are trying to do these renewable energy projects. I support renewable energy, but I'm anxious about who will bear the burden of the renewable energy.
Are comparing notes, comparing lessons learned, drafting guidelines to help developers and help regulatory agencies understand how to best avoid and mitigate impacts. And we have found that those national conversations that are going on are extremely beneficial so that we can learn further. And there have been some novel approaches that we started to borrow from our fellow states and our colleagues elsewhere. So.
And is there another question? Yeah.
Thank you.
King. Yeah.
Thank you, Chair Johanowitz. Thanks for your presentation, Sarah. My question is literally on a more practical level. What exactly is ODFW doing? For example, like we know, I saw one of the pictures of the windmills that they tend to shred raptors, things like that. So our role, is it to like help with the design so that maybe a windmill doesn't shred a raptor, or like where we place the solar panels?
And so at that point, it's our preference to ensure that mule deer and elk don't get stuck inside the facility. And so we recommend that they be 8 foot tall so that the ungulates can't jump over the fences. And so it pretty much precludes
How is that?
their option.
Okay, so, because those laws have helped us quite a bit, that goal.
It certainly puts wildlife concerns on the table and makes it an important part of the county's decision-making and the state's decision-making.
Okay. And just another one has in